Thoughtful, articulate artists, gifted, grammatical. Circular sources brimming with rich, flammable. Food for your thoughts, plated a different animal. Rounds on me, keep tabs, we insurmountable. Swerve, hey, Merle.
Buddy. Yeah, it's been a minute since I've been on live. Hi.
Hey, how are you doing?
I am doing well. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And so for those of you joining, so this is my Tuesday night mental health session called What's on Your Mind. And I'm so excited to have my guest with me today, Dr. Kojo. And we are going to be talking about racism and its impact on mental health. But before we get started, would you like to tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Kojo. I live here in Atlanta. It's a passion of mine. I post content primarily on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, to help break the stigma and make people feel more comfortable with going to therapy. Now I have my live show on Facebook that I do 4 times a week, where we talk about mental health topics and we keep it transparent, real, and vulnerable. My educational background, I have a DNP degree, doctor. I was working as a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner for a couple of years before I got to social media full time. I just appreciate everybody for having me, and all the love I get online is overwhelming in a good way. So I'm just happy to be here, and I'm happy that you reached out and you decided to have me on.
Absolutely, I appreciate you accepting. You actually hit a big milestone. Was it today on TikTok?
Yes, ma'am. We reached 2 million followers on TikTok. So
that is awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about racism and its impact on mental health. And the interesting thing with that is that it sort of impacts it in 2 ways, right? So there's the impact of dealing with racism on our mental health, and then there's the impact of our mental health and our mental health treatment and how racism impacts that with misdiagnosis and things like that. So I kind of want to separate the two a little bit and talk about both of them.
Right.
So the first one is to talk about how racism and how we deal with it impacts our mental health. And you have some really great videos about it. I posted a couple in my stories today for people to check out. But you just talk about the impact of racism on our mental health. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's profound, and this notion of racism, like we're aware, we're people of color, we're Black, so we know what it is. But for a majority of the country, they don't understand how racism affects us on a daily basis, and it definitely affects us. We have less access to mental health resources, so we're more likely to struggle, and when you struggle, you don't have anybody to reach out to. There's lack of education in our communities. There's a higher chance, like you said, of misdiagnosis. But specifically talking about the impact of racism on us, like you see the workforce. People of color having to be twice as good to get a chance. And not saying that whoever else, white people or whoever's on the other side, not saying that they don't deserve it, but people of color having to work 2 or 3 times as hard. And we saw it in the NFL not too long ago, a former head coach suing the NFL for racism, alleging that he's been giving sham interviews, and it's humiliating. That type of thing is humiliating when you realize that, somebody's hiring you. Like he interviewed for a job, and they already had given the job to somebody. And this is on the highest of levels. And you see these type of things in medicine, you see it in law, you see it wherever you go. So it's tough, when you talk about even just the imposter syndrome that comes with not feeling like you belong, but you have the same degree, you have the same qualifications as your peers, but you might not feel like you belong, because of the color of your skin. And that can be damaging for your self-esteem. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think that it's something, because imposter syndrome is something that people talk about frequently, but I think you never really realize like the racism implications of it. I mean, I know that I grew up always hearing, you have to work twice as hard to have half as much. And, when you're younger, you're like, all right, mom, whatever, it's so outdated. But then you get in the real world and I'm in corporate, and you realize how incredibly true that is.
Right.
And on one level, there's, like you were saying, where you feel like, oh, am I good enough? But then on the other level, I have to admit that there is a frustration that comes with it, where you're like, Not that you want to say like, oh, I'm smarter than everyone in the room,
Right.
because you don't necessarily feel that, but
Right.
because you have to work twice as hard to get as far, like there's sometimes where you're just like, what is happening here? Like, why did I have to put in so much and be so above this to be held at the same level as everyone else who gets to, sometimes it feels like they get to fail forward,
Right.
versus like you having to like climb at it. And that added stress makes an already stressful situation even more.
Yeah, no, it's difficult, and even when I mean, looking at myself, I think I've done well for myself, and I'm excited to be here and have the millions of followers. But when you look at the work that I have to put in, like I have full-time staff, I'm paying people. That's my biggest bill, so I'm putting it all on the line to do what I'm doing. I do believe that if I was white, or a different color, I'd be further along, But I'm running my own race, and hopefully, I'm inspiring people. But there is a frustration where you just know that there's something that, not that you deserve it, because we have to work hard regardless, but that if things were a little bit different, you could probably have more opportunities, and sometimes, like I hope to be successful. I know I'll be successful, so it's a mindset thing. But still, sometimes people who just don't want to acknowledge racism will say, oh, he made it, so everybody can make it, not acknowledging that I have to work 4 times as hard, exhaust myself just to get there. So I don't think you can, point to Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey and say that, anybody can make it. There's significant barriers that do affect people of color. And I think just by acknowledging it and making it more equitable, it can help to alleviate some of that stress, the anxiety, the imposter syndrome that comes with like just being Black in this country.
Yeah, and I think that that's sometimes what people don't realize is that underlying stress that always comes with it. And I know that you talked about some of the things that comes, that racism impacts our mental health is the added stress and the anxiety and the depression. And a lot of that comes from how much harder you have to work. And then the fact that even though like we know we have to work harder, we still have to deal with people feeling like we don't belong there just because of the color of our skin.
Right.
Like if we talk about like affirmative action, which people love saying like, oh, they're just there for the Black vote, they're just there for the whatever, without realizing that like affirmative action. So the way I always break it down is that like if there's 10 people who are going for a position and you have to give like 3 of them to a minority because of affirmative action, right? That means that the other race, white race, you have a 1 in 7 chance. So your top 7 are going to be getting that spot.
Right.
With the minorities, if we have 3, you have a 1 in 3 chance. So it's your top 7 and our top 3. Like they are the best of the best. So even like more deserving often than some of the other people in that spot. But then we still have to, once we enter those spaces, get treated like, oh, you were just given that spot. Meanwhile, our top 3 might be better than their, 4, 5, 6. And it's just, it's very frustrating dealing with that. What are some suggestions that you give your patients when they are trying to tackle or when they're dealing with that feeling that, like I don't belong, either that imposter syndrome or that added anxiety?
Right. I think you want to acknowledge it first and foremost, right? Sometimes you can get into this, mental gymnastics type of thing where like you're gaslighting yourself and you're like, I'm not sure if like, I belong here, or did I really experience that, or maybe I didn't go through that. Sometimes it gets confusing to figure out like what's actually going on. So I think it's important to acknowledge it, like it's there, like that's the truth, and there's no escaping it. Once you've acknowledged it and you've come to terms with it, and like you're at peace, still our responsibility to move forward and you can't, complaining is not effective. Like we have good reason to complain, but complaining is not effective. It doesn't move you any closer towards your goals. But acknowledging it and then taking the actionable steps towards the things that you want to pursue, and also speaking out is helpful, because there's some people who just don't get it, right? And the people who don't get it, I'm not going to spend my time trying to convince them. Like it is what it is. That person is hell bent on not seeing where you're coming from. That's fine. But there's some people, I do believe that there's people who are not, they don't identify as a minority, and they don't see like how serious racism is. They don't understand the fact that their Black friends that they go to school with, that they go to church with, that they break bread with, they don't understand that they have to live a different life, and all of these issues are like right here in plain sight. So I think for those people, those are the ones that I'm, focused on talking to, because they'll hear it and then they'll start to take steps on their own as allies and say, all right, how can I, be a part of the solution?
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I feel like those are the people that I try to cater my messages to as well, because I realize that some people, like, if they just want to have the cognitive dissonance of not understanding racism or white privilege, like, there's not much you can say
Right.
or do to get to them. And it's more so the people in the middle. And it's not, it's like, I feel like sometimes it's actually more frustrating dealing with the middle, though, because everybody can get on the same page when you're dealing with overt racism. Like when someone says something overtly racist, we're all like, you're a bad person. But when it's like microaggressions and like little racism things and implicit biases that are affecting a situation, then even the people who are your allies might be like, oh, well, they probably didn't mean it that way. And you're like, yes, they did. And so like that becomes more, like, for me, that's even more frustrating, because it's like, why don't you see? And then you're, like you said, you're almost gaslighting yourself, like, well, was that really racism? Like, am I just taking it out of context? And that becomes something that's, there we go back to that stress again.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think you want to, like, what I do is, like, I still believe in, speaking up and, do your best to change a narrative. But, your energy is important. I protect my energy. So if I try and I see that I'm being shot down, then I'm just gonna conserve my energy. I'm not gonna try and convince somebody 2 or 3 times. If anything, I'm gonna move my attention and interest elsewhere. And we're talking about impact of racism on mental health. We have to be real. Like, racism is there. Like, I see it every day. Like, it's not something that I particularly want to keep talking about all the time. I'll talk about it, but sometimes it can almost be traumatizing to have to, like, talk about it, not have anything done, and go into this cycle of, I talk, nobody hears. I talk, nobody hears. So at some point, I think you should talk. You should still talk and put it out there, and then you place the responsibility on other people to do what they have to do. That way, you've communicated, because communication is important. But like, getting the results that you need, sometimes it's time to take, yourself, your Black family, your Black kids, your Black dollars, to somewhere that you're appreciated. And people who choose to do that, I don't think you can blame them, because nobody wants to be somewhere where they don't feel like they're being appreciated or heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you that are watching, thank you so much. I see your comments. They're scrolling through quickly, but I do see them. But feel free to use the question box if you have any questions for the doctor and I will go through those as well. So as I mentioned when we first started, there's the two sides of mental impact and racism. The other side is getting help, right? I know you mentioned in one of your videos that Black people are 20% more likely to experience some type of, or to report some type of serious psychological distress.
Right.
So now we're reporting it, but then we go for help and we're dealing with being misdiagnosed. You mentioned in your comments that Black men get diagnosed with schizophrenia more, and I looked it up, and it's 4 times. They're 4 times more likely to get diagnosed with schizophrenia. Why is that?
It's because it's racism. I don't have any other explanation. And I remember back in school, I had a psychiatrist explain it to me, and he walked over to me, and he's an Indian psychiatrist, for context, and he was like, explaining to me how, he said, take you, somebody like you, with your skin, you're more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, as opposed to a white man exhibiting the same symptoms. Like, let's say you go to the ER, you're unruly, having a hard time, like a behavioral disturbance, right? For a lack of a better term. If you go into the ER like that, then they're gonna diagnose you as the Black guy with schizophrenia and diagnose the white guy with a mood disorder like bipolar disorder, because a Black person is seen to be more aggressive, so because of your diagnosis, and like in psychiatry, the treatment is based on the diagnosis, right? So if you're given a thought disorder like schizophrenia, they're more likely to rush over there, give you heavy neuroleptic medications, antipsychotics to shut you down. And you might not even be aggressive, but just that notion of like a big Black man, like it's still scary to to most people. So, the assessment that you get is probably abbreviated. It's probably like a quick look, oh, boom, schizophrenia, without checking for hallucinations and delusions and disorganized thought process. It's just, oh, black guy, we're just going to put this label on him, and just move forward. So I think it's important to speak up about this, and let people know, because I think some people are afraid of black people. Like, some people are
Yeah.
just afraid. Like, you could be the nicest person. I could just be sitting at Starbucks with my dog. Well, if I have my dog, I might appear more friendly, right? But me, just without my dog, maybe I'm wearing a do-rag, maybe I'm not, but it's like, oh, that's a black guy. Like, I wonder what he could do to me. I'm just sitting there drinking coffee, but I think people are just afraid of black people, and you see it not only in medicine, but all over. So I think it's important to talk about it.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that, well, no, a large part of that is due to the media. And I always say, like, that's why representation is so important. Because especially those of us who grew up or have been around diverse areas, we see a diverse mix of people. But for the most part, for the longest time, there's just a stereotype of Black people. And that's what people see. And Tyler, the Creator, actually once did an example, which I use all the time now. He's like, if you don't see a pit bull, but every time you see a pit bull on TV, that pit bull bites someone. And every time you see it, it's biting someone. When you see it in real life, you instantly think that pit bull bites, and that's your instant reaction. And unfortunately, that's how it is for a lot of Black people. Like, they're always the gangster or the bad guy, or they're doing whatever. And that's why it's important to have other representation, because that's how, because I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, so I always felt like I was lone wolf out there, like the only Black person like me. Found out that wasn't true, which was nice. But it's also great because other races need to see that as well, so they don't think of like an Oprah, like you mentioned, or an Obama, like an exception. Like, right. Oh, you're a different Black. You're another Black. You're Black, but you're not like other Black people. It's like, well, we're not a monolith, so like there is no not being like other Black people. Just like how there's diverse mix of white people, there's a diverse mix of Black people. But because that isn't portrayed enough, and only like more of the negative side, kind of like how Asians have the model minority thing, where they're all supposed to be brilliant and then they're not, some aren't, and they hate that. We unfortunately have it on the other side of being like thugs or overly sexualized as women, and it makes it a lot harder for us to navigate through life. And then also through getting that diagnosis, like you said, you come in and you're upset, and they might say mood with a white person, but with you it's schizophrenia because they assume you're violent.
Right. And I think it's damaging, especially for young Black kids, because you realize, being a young Black male, that, oh, I get attention when I act out, or more so like paying attention to me, like, oh, he's seen as aggressive, so sometimes you act getting attention. Even with Black women in the workplace, sometimes I think it's hard to speak up, because you might have a valid reason to speak up. There might be an injustice that you might have to speak out on, but by you speaking up on it, like, you're seen as like the angry Black woman, and then nobody's gonna listen to you. So these are things that over and over, it's depressing when you think of it. If your mindset's not, if you haven't been able to reframe this type of it's depressing when you think about it, because then you're like, oh, what's the point? Like, I'll never get the respect, like, what's the point of being Black in America? Like, I'm gonna be seen as a some type of second class citizen. But I think it's important to like talk about it, and then also reframe your thoughts, so that way you're not like stuck. Like, the trauma is there, yes, acknowledge it, work with it, do your best to move through it, but you're not like stuck at that level where like you're so mindful of the fact that it's there. Like, it's there, but we still have to move on, and we still have to, live our lives to the best of our abilities.
Yeah, and I love also that you mentioned the kids, because that's especially troubling for me. I love working with kids and dealing with kids, but the rate with which Black children are put in juvenile centers versus children of other races, and it's been reported that between 50 to 75% of the people in juvenile centers have some type of mental disorder. And so we have a case where in the suburbs or in different areas, they're getting therapy, they're getting second chances, they're getting help, they're getting treated for those mental health issues. In the Black community, they're just being put into juvenile, and that record is starting, and then it's staying with them. And it's so frustrating because it's like they're not getting the chance to grow up that they should. They don't get the, oh, they're just boys opportunity. They don't get the, they're young and they'll grow out of it. And like I said, I grew up in white suburbia, so I can tell you those kids are not better than the urban kids. Like, they get into just as much trouble, they do just as much drugs, they do just as many bad things. They're just not getting arrested for it at the rate with which our kids are getting arrested for it. And that, for me, is frustrating and is also heartbreaking as well. And for a lot of kids, for a lot of people, mental illness starts showing signs of it in your teens. What are some things that maybe like parents could look out for that would alert them to maybe, or just even in general, speaking about mental health or mental illness to their teens, that would hopefully help them during that difficult stage?
Yeah, so normally I tell people, like, your person, your son, your spouse, your parent. Normally when you see like a deviation, like in how they behave, like they go to bed every day at 9 o'clock. And that's just what they do. And all of a sudden, their sleep patterns is erratic. They're sleeping at 2 a.m. Sometimes they're not sleeping. They're missing out on meals. Anything that is a huge deviation from how they normally are, I think that's a good time to, check in on them and have that conversation. Obviously, if sleep patterns are disturbed, if they're not eating as much or they're eating too much, or if they've stopped doing their favorite activities. Like, the example I give for myself is, like, I love football. Like, I'll spend my last dollar to see my team go to the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
If my team was in the Super Bowl, right? Hypothetically speaking, hopefully one day, right? But if my team was in
Who's your team?
The Titans, Tennessee Titans.
Okay. Go Titans.
Yeah, tighten up. But if my team and the game is playing and I'm in my room in the dark room, not watching the game, something's going on. That's something that I enjoy. Like, why is he not watching the game? So, like, if you are not bike riding and you always do that, if you would work out and you're not doing that, if you would go hang out with your friends, play bingo on Thursday nights and you haven't missed that in weeks, and all of a sudden you're not doing that, then it could be a sign to at least check in on them. Maybe they just overslept. But if they're isolating themselves, it could be a sign that, okay, they might be going through something. And it doesn't have to be that, they're depressed, but you always want to check and be as preemptive as possible, because it's easier to catch it in the beginning. Sometimes you let things linger, and before you know it, it's a full-on crisis. And then, you have to use emergent actions to take care of an emergency. So anytime you see like a big deviation in how somebody acts, I think that's a good time to check in on them and at least have that conversation. And that person would most likely appreciate it, just to know that somebody's watching. Because sometimes when people are hopeless, right? And hopelessness is the hallmark sign of suicidal ideation. When people are hopeless, they get to this whole mindset of what's the point? Their thoughts are negative, and they don't have any reason to like hang around for tomorrow, right? So if somebody's asking about them, then it puts that thought in their head, like maybe somebody does care. I didn't know people cared, and that could be like the catalyst for them getting help. So just any type of deviation from how they normally are, I think that's a good time to start that conversation.
Yeah, I think that that's good too, and I think also just the way like we talked about the way that men are viewed and boys are viewed, Black men as being threats, and realizing that, they're not really. And despite how much we're portrayed that in the media, I think that sometimes without even realizing it, can talk to and interact with them that way when they're not. And I think just even being more human to them and being more kind to them and not expecting like the roughness and treating them with the same gentleness you would everyone else, I think makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I remember, I live in LA now, but I a clothing company that I was operating a couple of years ago, and I remember there was this cute little baby, and the mom was young, maybe in her 20s, maybe a teen mom. So it was a cute baby, then the mom, then the grandma, right? I was assuming it's the grandma. Then they're in line, and this baby is eyes at me and my friend, right? And she Hispanic, I think she's Hispanic, right? But she appears white. So we're in line. We finished shooting the commercial, and it's such a cute baby. So like I buy the baby like a little $8 toy, and I gave the toy to the baby, right? and the mom was holding the baby, and the look that they had on their face, you know, and it was a white baby, white family. They had this look that it was like, I didn't know that black people were like kind or like non-threatening, and like I peeped it, but they were so shocked, like, oh, like they were taken aback by the fact that this tall black guy did something nice for their child. This is a cute baby, just bought like a little $8 toy. So I saw it and I didn't say anything. My friend, who's Hispanic, she saw it and she was like, "Did you see that? That was weird. It was almost as if they thought that you weren't capable of doing that." And I didn't say it, like I peeped it and I just kind of went on. But then when she said it, I'm like, all right, so if she saw it, then other people in the store must have seen it. But these little things that happen from time to time that make you realize that people really do view you in a certain light. And like you're mindful of that. Like when I go to the gym and it's late at night, I try not to trail behind somebody. You know, I try to keep my space because nobody's going to be like, oh my gosh, it's Dr. Kojo off of TikTok with 2 million followers. They're gonna, that's this big black guy falling behind me. So I chill out. You know, I do my best to not appear, you know, threatening or whatever the case is. But I think at a young age, kids are aware of that, and that can be definitely traumatizing for like a 7-year-old, you know, black male. Like that's his first experience of racism. You know, it's just sad if you think about it.
Yeah, it's horrible because it's something that always weighs on your mind. You know, like even with me, like a lifetime of making sure I don't fit into the angry black woman trope. So even when someone makes me upset, and like the few times I have actually expressed being upset at work, having it then come back on me. Like I once had a coworker who was like harassing me and finally got sick of it and said something to my boss and asked to move. And then when we did our year-end thing, I got points marked down for not getting along with my coworkers. It's like he was harassing me. And so it's like this constant thing that you are constantly trying to go through life and live, but then also trying to mitigate how other people see you as well to make sure that you're not threatening until you get to your 30s like me and you're like, I don't care, I'm going to be me.
Right.
You're going to deal with it. But for the most part, you know, you're just kind of like, well, I hope that people don't perceive me a certain way. And it's exhausting and it's draining. And then especially if you have depression or you're going through a depression episode on top of that, it makes that even worse.
Right.
Tough. I was going to say, so we have a few questions. Thank you all so much. One of them is, so psychological discrepancies are an excuse to diagnose black people with arbitrary diseases. So I think they're asking, like, do those discrepancies lead to, and that's from Jetty, so I hope I'm explaining your question right. Like, are those discrepancies used as an excuse to diagnose us with diseases that we may not have?
And there could be. I mean, I would. That's part of the issue. You know, like, and when they say psychological discrepancies, they talk about how like we're viewed, or what's the angle in the question?
I don't know. It popped up earlier, so I'm guessing it's probably when we were talking about schizophrenia and like the behavioral things and how they're. And Jetty, if you're still in the chat, if you want to expand on the question, you can. But I think that's physiological. Sorry, or I could read. Yeah.
And yeah, I would imagine that would be a part of it. You know, because even the DSM-5, you know, sometimes I question, or a lot of times I question, like, how well does it represent people of color, right? Because, you know, 63% of African Americans, according to NAMI, believe that, you know, having a mental health condition is a sign of weakness. You know, like that's, you can look that up. So when people of color are not seeking help, then you're gonna, you know, compile your data on people who don't look like us. You know, how does schizophrenia look like in a young black male, right? It's gonna look different, you know, and I don't think we necessarily know because black people haven't received, you know, help at the same rates that other races have. So I definitely think that there's a lot that could go into it, and definitely, you know, you could have maybe. Like there's so much. I have nowhere to start because I feel like we haven't even scratched the surface. Like the next version of the DSM is gonna have to.
And could you just let, I know it's the book with mental illnesses, but could you let, for those who may not know, what DSM stands for and what it is?
Right. So the DSM, think of it as like the Bible of psychiatry. You know, that's the book that we have, that big book over there that we use to diagnose mental health conditions. So, you know, there's different versions of it, and we have the 5th edition now. And that's how we would diagnose somebody. So whether it's ADHD, depression, or whatever, they have the guidelines in there. So when you open up the DSM, it will tell you for schizophrenia, you need hallucinations, delusions, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't break it down into what it would look like based off of somebody, or what it would look like, you know, male, female. But they just have the data that we have so far. So I think as more people seek help, you know, hopefully we can get a better representation. But like I've never really felt that it kind of, I don't think it's a good snapshot of us as a people, because, you know, you could just be upset. You could just be having a bad day, and you could be irritable. It doesn't mean that you're anxious. It doesn't mean that you have schizophrenia. It doesn't mean that you're bipolar, right? You know, but, you know, even to take bipolar, for example, like when somebody lands in the hospital and they attribute it to mania, right? Because with bipolar disorder, you have to have either mania or hypomania, which will last for at least 4 to 7 days, you know. But for safety reasons, if you're manic, right, or you believe to be manic, and you land in the hospital before that 4-day period, they automatically give you the diagnosis of bipolar 1 it's a safety issue. So if you have a young black male who had a bad day, I'm just making a story out there. He had a bad day, and then you know, somebody thought that he was extremely harmful to himself or other people, and he was very irritable. And then they say, oh, he hasn't slept in days or whatever, and they think he's manic. He's going to the psych hospital, and he's getting that diagnosis of bipolar disorder. You know, and maybe he's gonna start to be in need. You know, so I think it's important to talk about that. I know you wanted me to actually say what it stood for. I thought you wanted me to explain the
Oh, I did. Yeah.
diagnostical and statistical manual for mental disorders. But yeah, my point, I think it's very to talk about it, because for people of color, and I don't think we talk about this enough in our community. And I would say I know we don't talk about it because I don't see that conversation being had on TV. But for people of color, it's gonna look different. Somebody who is, you know, white or another race. So I think it's important that we talk about that, and also the stereotypes that people see on TV. You know, if you have, let's say you have a psychiatrist who grew up in somewhere where there's not a lot of black people, like your neighborhood where you grew up in, you know. Yeah. And some people, their first experience with black people is from what they saw on TV. You know, maybe they saw the Cosby Show, you know, and they thought black people were docile. Or maybe they watched a Nelly music video and they thought that black people were thugs. You know, so if that's their first experience with black people, and then they get to the hospital and they see a black patient with a do-rag, they're thinking, oh my gosh, this is a thug. You know, if this guy moves, you know, one way to left or right, we have to like give him a whole lot of medications, you know. So I think it's something that unless we collectively get together and have the conversation, we're gonna kind of be behind as a people. I do think we'll struggle until we talk about it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And like you said with the book, because we're so limited in seeking out help, the statistics, the practices, they're all slightly off on the treatment of us. And I know that, you know, in a perfect world, we're all the same, we're all equal, but we know that that's not true. We know the black experience, especially in America, is different than the white experience, no matter where you grew up. Even growing up in the nice suburbs like me, my black experience is different than, you know, my white counterparts. And that needs to be taken into consideration with things like diagnosis, and it's not. And so it makes it harder when they're trying to diagnose our natural personality, cultures, whatever, with white diagnosis symptoms.
Yeah. And another story I can think of, back at the state hospital back in Georgia, I remember a patient came in, this is like 2014, and the year is important because this is when Young Thug was coming up. Young Thug was like first coming on the scene. So around that 2014, 2015 time period. And the patient was coming in, and he was like in the courtyard, right outside. He was rapping Young Thug, and I knew the song because that was one of the songs I used to listen to, you know. So the patient was rapping the Young Thug, and I was just making rounds with the psychiatrist, and I saw him like write down like disorganized speech, and I'm like, no, that's Young Thug. I'm like,
no.
you know, I'm still like I'm like, I know that song. That's Young Thug. But then it's like, it's that psychiatrist. It's not his fault that he doesn't know who Young Thug is, right? But it's like, if we're people of color, right, and we know that that's a rap song, then we're not gonna characterize that as disorganized speech, right? I'm like, I listened to that song, you know, like I like that song. So sometimes, you know, and like when I saw that, a piece of me, I felt a little sad, because like it's like you kind of stuck, like I'm not even like in charge. Like the psychiatrist is the head boss. He's gonna make the calls, right? And he might take that to be disorganized speech, and because of that, that patient might get an extra dose of Haldol. But he's just wrapping us. So I think some of these cultural differences is really important to talk about it. And as more people of color get into medicine, and you know, you see people, you see ourselves represented in these different fields, I'm hopeful that it'll get better.
Yeah, absolutely. A few more questions.
Okay.
Oh, also, someone asked if we would save this. Yes, I save all of the lives there in mine, and I do these for those who hopped on later every Tuesday about mental health. So you can find various topics in there.
My page after the fact.
You what?
I'll also share this same live on my after the fact. How to spin it and save it.
Someone said, I want to take an ADHD test. How does that happen? And I know you speak a lot about ADHD on your page as well.
Yeah, so from how I know ADHD to be diagnosed, you know, through the aforementioned DSM, you know, there's questionnaires online. You can pull them up, you know, and sometimes we do use questionnaires in the clinical setting. There's different questionnaires for kids, there's questionnaires for adults, but the way you diagnose ADHD is by getting a good history, you know. So your provider, your psychiatric provider, would ask you a lot of questions, you know, about how you're doing now. Like, are you inattentive? Are you hyperactive? Are you impulsive? Are you forgetful? You know, so they'll take all your symptoms and see if you match the criteria for somebody with ADHD. They would ask you about your childhood growing up, because technically ADHD should have presented before the age of 12. But if you're like me and you grew up in a household where, you know, you didn't have insurance, you didn't want to bother your parents and tell them that you can't focus in school because they're already trying to pay the bills and they're behind, then, you know, you're going to struggle in silence, right? So a lot of people were struggling. Like, they had these issues when they were, you know, during their formative years, but they never really got the help. So when you talk to, you know, your psychiatric provider, like a psychiatrist or a nurse practitioner, then they'll ask you all these questions. They'll give you the questionnaire, but they'll ask you these questions. They'll match it up with, you know, what we think ADHD should appear as. And then after they have enough information, and sometimes some providers might want collateral information. They might want to hear from your spouse or people that know you to see how you're described. But once they go through that series of questions, then that's how you diagnose ADHD. So it's not through like a psychological test or like an online test. You'd have to talk to a provider. And after that, then they would diagnose you. But there's no harm in maybe taking a test, you know, if you feel like you can identify with the information, because when you go in for professional help, you're going to have to recall your symptoms. And somebody said that they bought my book. Thank you so much. I think it's Yesenia or whoever that is. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I know that probably both with ADHD and I talked to someone once about like autism, especially for us, it's misdiagnosed young because we do have so much of our population just not really believing in mental health. And, you know, like, so a lot of the things where maybe other cultures or other races are looking out for those symbols, clues, and signs like fidgeting or different things like that, we're just told like, sit still, stop doing that. Like, and so you develop, I wish I remembered the exact word for it, but where you mimic regular behavior, even though that's not your actual mannerisms, and it doesn't cure them of it. What is it?
You mean masking or?
Yeah. So like, so what happens in our culture is that we develop those like masking techniques, and we might have autism or ADHD, but at a young age. And like you said, like dealing with just life stuff, what your parents have to go through, you're not trying to add on to that. So we end up getting diagnosed with those things much later than other races might.
Yeah, and also just to take it back off that, sometimes in our community we're afraid of a label, so sometimes the you know how in the black community we have this really tight bond with the church, and then nothing's
Yeah.
wrong. I'm still a Bible believing Christian, but sometimes people will place or I've seen in our community, I don't want to say everybody, but I've seen it to where the pastor is like the head of everything, and they'll take a pastor's word over a professional's word. Sometimes you might have a kid with, maybe the doctor says we suspect that the kid has autism, and parents reject it, like, no, my child doesn't have that. I'll pray for them. They'll be healed. They'll start to talk soon, but I think it's helpful to, sometimes not deny that diagnosis, which could help them get the help that they need, instead of, having them struggle throughout life and then they become an adult and then they have to go see the diagnosis on their own.
Yeah, and the church is so huge in our community, which is great. I'm a Christian too, but it can also be damaging in these situations. I started earlier this year, I got a fellowship with NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness. Thank you. The diversity and equity thing. And so my job is just sort of trying to figure out how to get the community more knowledgeable and get information out there. And I was like, well, the first thing I want to do is tackle the religious community. So like right now, I'm trying to get with all like the clergy in the area and get them all mental health first aid training. Cause I'm like, even just that is such a huge first step for them to like be able to recognize the signs and the symbols. Cause when people come to them, they don't have to have all the answers, but they can at least recognize it. I feel like that's huge step in the right direction.
That's huge. Like literally, I think for even the people who are watching at home, like the simplest, smallest things in the right direction, it goes a long way. I think that would be a fantastic idea. I never thought of that. I don't know why I never thought about that. That's a great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What is your opinion? I'm going to ask two questions. I'm down here. One is, what is your opinion on self-diagnosis? And the other one is, do you think individual people of color who deal with intergenerational trauma from colonialism will have a harder time healing through it until a society takes accountability?
Good question. Put me on the
Good
spot.
Question.
I like being put on the spot. So for the first question, was
how do you feel about self-diagnosis?
I forgot that. About the self-diagnosis part, whether we like it or not, in this country, being able to have good healthcare is a privilege, unfortunately. I think healthcare should be a right. I think you should be born with the ability to get healthcare. Like, it's essential. But it's a privilege, and unfortunately it becomes a game of the people who have it versus people who don't have it. Those who have it are able to get the proper medical help, and those who don't sometimes have to suffer in silence. So when it comes to self-diagnosis, I think that being able to get a diagnosis is a privilege. There is some privilege to getting a diagnosis. So when you self-diagnose, there's nothing wrong with the notion of identifying. Take ADHD, for example. When I talk about it in my book online, I got diagnosed when I was 25, but I felt like I knew I had it like in second grade. By seventh grade, I was like, sure, I had it, but obviously I wasn't able to get the help because of the family situation. So there's nothing wrong with identifying with a condition and feeling like, I just feel like I'm depressed, or I just feel like I have bad anxiety, or I feel like I have social anxiety or ADHD. There's nothing wrong with identifying with that, but if you can, some way, somehow, confirm that with a professional, that would be the next step that I would hope that the people who are watching will go ahead and do. If you can just confirm that next step with a professional. And the second question was, do you think that people of color are affected by they write down intergenerational trauma? Was that it?
Yeah, intergenerational trauma, and it will make it harder. It will have harder time healing through it until society accepts accountability.
So it's funny. My perspective on this, I feel like all of us, black, white, however somebody identifies, I think we're all affected by the nation's, dark past in history. Like you can't tell me that affected, or we don't pay the price somehow, and it's not until like we have Black History Month, or you have to like learn about Black history, and then you figure out what's going on in Selma, Alabama, letting dogs out on Black people, and even before that, Black people not being able to vote, and then you talk about Juneteenth and slavery. This country is a pretty dark past with racism and treating people of color like as second class citizens, or even worse than that. So I think even white people are affected by it, because those are their ancestors, and like we all have to have these uncomfortable conversations, and when you sit down there with a friend of yours who they're white and they're an ally, and then you're talking about racism, like you talk about how it affects you and how they see things. I think we're all affected by it, in a sense, and I don't want it to be something that should prevent us from moving forward. I think we should always do whatever we can to move forward and to work through what we're going through. But I feel like we're all affected by it, and I grew up in Norway before I came to the States. I'm in Europe, and I felt like the moment I hit Nashville, Tennessee, like I could feel the racism in it. Like I didn't know I was Black, and I was living. There's more white people in Norway, percentage-wise, than in the United States. But I didn't feel that I was Black until I got here. So there's something about the way this country operates that we all have to, do our part to address these issues and move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you so much for your time. I won't keep you too much longer.
No problem. I appreciate the invite.
Okay. Yes. Okay, so two more. Can excessive sleeping and skipping meals be a side effect of having depression? And on balance, getting a diagnosis, having a and a question about balancing getting a diagnosis and having a diagnosis used against you in court. So one of the questions was, excessive sleep and affecting depression. The other one was a diagnosis affecting you in court.
Yeah. So with depression, sometimes, we think that people aren't sleeping or they aren't eating, but sometimes you can have different kinds of depression. You can have seasonal depression. You can have atypical depression, which doesn't present, in the normal ways that you would see it. So there are times when you see people overeat, or sleep too much, and seeing them sleep for 12 to 14 hours a day, sometimes even longer. They spend the majority of their time in bed, and even with that atypical type of depression, sometimes we see leaden paralysis, where it just feels like your limbs are heavier. So it's just harder to get out of bed, right? If you weigh 120 pounds, you still weigh that, but all of a sudden you feel like it's so much harder to just get your body out of bed. So sleeping too much, or hypersomnia, as we call it, sometimes we see that as a sign of atypical depression. So that's why it's so important to educate people, because they might think that, oh, I'm getting sleep, so I'm not depressed, but the opposite side of the spectrum, where they're getting too much sleep. And the second question was about the diagnosis in court, right?
Yeah. Balancing getting a diagnosis and having that diagnosis used against you in the courts.
So it depends on what the court case is. And I spent a little over a year doing forensic psychiatry, but I still want to be careful with this question, because it depends, like it depends on the case. Like if the judge wants to go get the records, I'm not sure. I'm not too well versed on the legal system, but certain times, like if it's a court case, or maybe if somebody's in the military, there's times when diagnosis will mean something. So for example, for me, like when I was working back in Virginia, I was on an NGRI unit, which means not guilty by reason of insanity. So I had patients who had committed crimes anywhere from petty theft to homicide, murder, robbery, all kinds of things. And because of their mental state at the time of their offense, because they had either schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, or severe depression, or whatever they had, because of their mental health condition, they were deemed not guilty by reason of insanity. So instead of being in, in jail or prison, they come to the psychiatric hospital and they get help. And then, we go back and forth to court, and we work on conditional release, and then we get them back into a controlled environment on the outside. So sometimes diagnoses, they do matter in court. But I want to say it depends on the court case. And because I'm not sure court cases, I'm not sure how to take that question. But I do believe that they matter.
Well, I can't thank you enough for having this conversation with me. It's an important conversation. This was a good start, and I appreciate this conversation and you taking the time to share some of your knowledge with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it, and I like what you're doing on the platform. These are conversations that need to be had. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy that you're doing better.
Thank you. And is there anything that you want to share? I know someone mentioned buying one of your books. I know you're making it big on TikTok. Is there anything else that you want to share to let the people know about?
I would say it's so much going on. I'd say the best thing is to follow my Instagram and click the link in there and see what I'm up to. I mean, there's my first book was an Amazon bestseller in 2019 when it came out. It's still available for purchase on Amazon. I have another book coming out this summer, a mental health workbook. That would be like in Barnes and Nobles and different stores. So I'm excited for that. And I'm posting, frequently on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook Reels. So yeah, just by following me on my Instagram, you can keep up with what I'm doing in that little link there. I think that's simple.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, and thank you everybody who joined us, and thank you again, Dr. Kojo.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.